I stood in the doorway of what was now my house, the Victorian mansion that had belonged to my grandparents for over 60 years. At 32, I finally understood why Grandma Martha always said that some inheritances come with more than money, they come with truth. And sometimes, the truth is the heaviest burden of all. Growing up in our sprawling colonial home in Connecticut, I learned early that appearances mattered more than reality in the Blake family. We had what people called old money wealth that whispered rather than shouted, displayed through antique furniture, private school educations, and charity galas where my mother, Eleanor, would glide through crowds in designer gowns while my father, Richard, discussed market trends with other successful men. But behind the polished facade, a different story unfolded daily. I was the older daughter, 4 years senior to Madison, yet I lived like a shadow in my own home. The pattern established itself so early that I barely questioned it until much later. When I brought home straight A's in 7th grade, my report card received a cursory glance from my father and a distracted, "Good job, Abby," before being set aside. But when Madison managed even a single A among her usual B's and C's, our dining room transformed into a celebration venue. "Madison has been working so incredibly hard," my mother would announce to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the pride I longed to hear directed at me. "She deserves special recognition." I would sit quietly at these impromptu celebrations, mechanically cutting my food while wondering what invisible quality made Madison's achievements worthy of fanfare, while mine warranted only acknowledgement. The most painful part wasn't the lack of celebration, it was the way my parents seemed genuinely surprised by my consistency, as if expecting less from me had become their natural state. The disparity crystallized during my sophomore year when I won the regional essay contest, a competition that drew entries from across New England. I was 15, bursting with pride, imagining finally earning the kind of attention Madison received for far smaller accomplishments. The award ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the local Civic Center. That morning, Madison developed what my mother termed one of her sensitive episodes, a mysterious illness that seemed to strike whenever attention might shift away from her. By afternoon, she was dramatically draped across the living room sofa, one pale hand pressed to her forehead. "I just feel so awful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything hurts." My parents exchanged worried glances. "Perhaps we should stay home," my mother suggested, though she was already reaching for her phone to cancel their plans. "But it's Abigail's award ceremony," I said, hating how desperate I sounded. My father sighed, loosening his tie. "Your sister needs us, Abby. You understand? You're stronger than Madison. You can handle these things on your own." And there it was, the curse of being labeled strong. In my family's logic, strength meant deserving less support, less attention, less love. I attended the ceremony alone, accepted my award with a smile I didn't feel, and drove home to find Madison miraculously recovered, chatting animatedly with our parents about her weekend plans. My salvation came in the form of my grandparents' Victorian home, just 30 minutes away, but worlds apart from the cold perfection of my parents' house. Martha and Harold Blake lived in a house that breathed with warmth, slightly cluttered with meaningful mementos, always smelling of cinnamon and old books, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that invited long conversations. From my earliest memories, every other weekend at their house felt like stepping into a different universe. When I was 7 and announced I wanted to be a scientist, Grandpa Harold didn't smile indulgently and change the subject. Instead, he drove me to the library and helped me check out every book on astronomy they had for children. "The smart one has big dreams," he'd say, ruffling my hair. When I was 9 and wrote my first short story, Grandma Martha didn't just read it, she asked thoughtful questions about my character's motivations and suggested I keep a journal of story ideas. It was during Thanksgiving dinner when I was 11 that I first understood my grandparents saw something my parents missed. I was helping clear dishes when I overheard a heated conversation from the living room. "Richard, you missed Abigail's science fair yesterday." Grandma Martha's voice carried an uncharacteristic edge. "She won first place. We were there. But she kept looking toward the door, hoping you'd arrive." "Mother, we had Madison's dance recital," my father replied, his tone defensive. "You know how important her dancing is to her future. Abigail understands." "Does she?" Grandpa Harold interjected, his voice quiet but firm. The girl looked heartbroken. My mother's sigh was audible even from the kitchen. "Martha, Harold, please don't start this again. We love both our girls equally. They just have different needs." Even at 11, I knew that wasn't true. Madison needed constant attention and praise. I apparently needed to accept being invisible. As I grew older, my grandparents became more than just loving relatives. They became my teachers. Grandpa Harold, who had managed the family investments for decades, began showing me the financial documents that tracked our family's wealth through generations. These weren't just numbers to him. They were stories of responsibility and stewardship. "Your great-grandmother Sophia saved this family during the Depression," he told me one rainy Saturday when I was 16, pulling out yellowed ledgers from his study. "She understood that money is just a tool. It's character that determines how it's used." During my senior year of high school, when my parents hired expensive SAT tutors for Madison, while dismissing my request for the same support, "You're naturally good at tests, Abby." My grandparents quietly arranged for private tutoring. They never made it feel like charity. "We're investing in your future," Grandma Martha explained when I protested. "Someday, you'll do the same for someone who needs it." College should have been my escape. But even at Dartmouth, 200 miles from home, I couldn't outrun my family's dynamics. I chose finance over my passion for literature, desperately hoping that speaking my father's language might finally earn his respect. When I graduated summa cum laude, my parents attended the ceremony but left immediately afterward. "Madison called," my mother explained, already gathering her purse. "She's feeling overwhelmed about her gap year decisions. You understand she needs our support right now." I stood in my cap and gown, watching them hurry away while other families took photos and went to celebratory dinners. My grandparents had stayed, of course, and they took me to a quiet restaurant where Grandpa Harold raised his glass. "To our brilliant granddaughters, huh?" he said, his eyes bright with pride. "Your worth isn't determined by others' ability to see it." Those words became my anchor through the years that followed. When I landed my first job at a prestigious investment firm in Boston, my parents' response was lukewarm. When Madison got hired as a receptionist at a local salon, they acted as if she'd been named CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The financial education my grandfather had provided proved invaluable in more ways than one. During my second year at Dartmouth, when budget cuts eliminated my partial scholarship, I called my parents for help. My mother's response was swift and crushing. "Abigail, we've already committed to covering Madison's entire education at Westfield State," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "You know she needs the support more than you do. Can't you just take out additional loans? You're studying finance, you'll be able to pay them back eventually." What she didn't know was that I'd lost the scholarship because I'd spent countless hours helping Madison with her college applications instead of maintaining my perfect GPA. I'd thought that supporting my sister might finally earn my parents' approval. Instead, it had cost me financially while going completely unnoticed. 2 days later, Grandpa Harold called with what he termed an investment opportunity. My grandparents wanted to fund not just the remainder of my undergraduate education, but also my MBA. When I protested, Grandma Martha's response was characteristically wise. "Darling, this isn't charity. This is recognizing potential and nurturing it. Sometimes family means seeing what others miss." The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, shattering the routine I'd built around my weekly visits to my grandparents. I was reviewing client portfolios when my mother's number flashed on my phone, unusual enough to make my stomach clench with premonition. "Abigail, there's been an accident." Her voice was controlled but strained. "Your grandparents were driving back from their lake house. The road was wet from rain." The silence stretched until I couldn't bear it. "Mom, they're gone! Abigail, both of them!" The funeral was elegant and somber, befitting two people who had lived with such dignity. I was asked to deliver the eulogy, a responsibility that both honored and terrified me. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I spoke from my heart about two people who had shaped my understanding of unconditional love. "Martha and Harold Blake didn't just teach me about our family history," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "They taught me about integrity, about quiet strength, and about loving without conditions. They saw people for who they truly were and valued authentic connection above all else." From the corner of my eye, I noticed my mother shift uncomfortably in the front pew. Beside her, my father stared stonily ahead, his expression unreadable. 3 days after the funeral, Benjamin Thornton requested our presence at his office for the reading of the will. The atmosphere in his wood-paneled conference room was tense as my parents, Madison, and I took seats around the polished table. "Before I begin the specific distributions," Benjamin said, opening a leather portfolio, "I should note that Martha and Harold Blake's estate is valued at approximately $12 million, including properties, investments, and personal assets." My mother gasped audibly. Even I was surprised by the figure, though Grandpa Harold had given me hints about their substantial holdings over the years. Benjamin continued methodically. "To their granddaughter, Madison Blake, they leave their lake house property in New Hampshire, valued at approximately $1.2 million, along with a cash gift of $800,000. Madison smiled through her tears, glancing at me with what looked like satisfaction. "To their son, Richard Blake, and daughter-in-law, Eleanor Blake. They leave their collection of art and antiques, valued at approximately $1 million, as well as a cash gift of $500,000. My father nodded, his expression calculating as he squeezed my mother's hand. Benjamin cleared his throat before continuing. "And to their granddaughter, Abigail Blake, they leave the primary residence in Connecticut, valued at $2.5 million. Their investment portfolio, valued at approximately $5 million, their remaining cash assets of approximately $500,000, and all remaining personal effects not specifically designated elsewhere." The silence in the room was absolute for 3 full seconds before my mother's voice cut through it like glass. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Benjamin looked at her calmly. "There is no mistake. Mrs. Blake. The will is quite clear and was updated just 6 months ago, with Martha and Harold of sound mind and body, witnessed appropriately." "But that's not fair," Madison burst out, her previous satisfaction evaporating. "Why would they leave Abigail almost everything I was their granddaughter to?" I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. While I had known my grandparents valued our relationship, I never expected this level of disparity in their final wishes. "This is outrageous," my father finally spoke, his voice cold. "My parents would never have intentionally created such an imbalance. Abigail must have influenced them somehow." I felt as though I'd been slapped. "Excuse me?" The accusations flew fast and sharp. I had manipulated them. I had isolated them from the family. I had taken advantage of their age and vulnerability. As we left Benjamin's office, the divide in our family had never felt wider or more unbridgeable. The war began with surgical precision. 3 days after the will reading, my mother called, her voice honeyed in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Abigail, darling, I hope you're processing everything well," she began. Your father and I have been thinking about what Grandma and Grandpa would really want for our family. You know, Madison has been struggling financially with her salon startup, and that inheritance, well, it's really quite excessive for one person, don't you think? Surely you plan to share some of it with your sister. That would be the right thing to do. When I didn't immediately agree, the calls intensified. My father took a more direct approach during one particularly strained conversation. Abigail, this situation is creating unnecessary tension in the family. Madison is your sister. Blood should mean something to you. The emotional manipulation escalated to what I would later recognize as a coordinated ambush. I arrived at my parents' house for what I thought would be a quiet Sunday dinner, only to find they had assembled an intervention. Uncle Thomas, Aunt Patricia, and my cousin Brittany were all there, their faces grave with purpose. We thought it would be good to have a family discussion, my mother announced after a painfully silent appetizer course. What followed was a systematic attack. Uncle Thomas spoke about family loyalty and how my grandparents couldn't have meant for the family to be divided. Aunt Patricia tearfully described how hurt Madison was, how she'd always been close to her grandparents. Madison herself alternated between sullen silence and dramatic accusations. She visited them constantly, Madison sobbed to the assembled relatives. She made sure she was their favorite. She probably filled their heads with lies about the rest of us. Only Aunt Grace, who arrived late and hadn't been briefed on the intervention, seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings. I don't understand why we're discussing Martha and Harold's private decisions as if they're up for family vote, she said, frowning at my father. They were of sound mind and had every right to distribute their estate as they saw fit. But Aunt Grace was outnumbered. The message was clear: either I voluntarily redistributed my inheritance or I would face the consequences. When emotional manipulation failed, Madison launched her social media campaign. Her posts were masterfully crafted, painting a heartbreaking picture of a loving granddaughter betrayed by a manipulative sister. According to her narrative, I had systematically isolated our elderly grandparents, turning them against their own family through lies and emotional manipulation. Within days, these posts were being shared by family friends, former classmates, even some of my professional contacts. I started receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, expressing their disappointment in my behavior. The isolation was crushing just when I needed support most. I found myself completely alone. Then came the revelation that changed everything. My cousin Stephanie called, her voice tight with information she could barely contain. "Abby, I just found out something you need to know. Last Christmas, when you weren't at the family party because you were with Grandma and Grandpa, your parents had a huge fight with them. Mom overheard the whole thing through the kitchen door." My blood went cold. "What kind of fight?" "Your parents were demanding that Grandma and Grandpa change their will. They wanted everything split equally between you and Madison. When Grandpa Harold refused, your dad actually accused him of being senile and said maybe it was time to consider professional care for them both." The pieces suddenly fell into place: my grandparents' slightly strained relationship with my parents over the past year, their cryptic comments about difficult decisions, the way Grandpa Harold had seemed especially determined to ensure I understood the family finances. They hadn't just been preparing me for their deaths, they'd been preparing me for this war. The formal lawsuit arrived via process server at my office, humiliating me in front of colleagues and clients. The legal papers were devastating in their accusations: undue influence, elder abuse, financial manipulation, and isolation of vulnerable elderly persons. My parents had hired Lawrence Peterson, a shark of a lawyer known for his aggressive tactics in inheritance disputes. The allegations painted me as a calculating predator who had systematically exploited my grandparents' love and trust. According to the lawsuit, I had inserted myself inappropriately into their financial affairs, created deliberate friction between the deceased and their loving family members, and took advantage of their declining mental faculties to secure an unconscionably disproportionate inheritance. Reading these accusations felt like looking at a description of someone I didn't recognize. The family that should have been united in grief was now irreparably divided by greed and legal warfare. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the darkest of my life. I took emergency leave from work, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the upcoming trial. Madison's social media campaign had been devastatingly effective. Old friends stopped calling. Extended family members crossed the street to avoid me. Even my building's doorman started looking at me with suspicion. Benjamin became my lifeline during this period, not just as my attorney, but as the one person who truly understood my grandparents' character and intentions. "Abigail," he said during one of our preparation sessions, his voice gentle but firm. "I think it's time we discuss some additional information your grandparents left in my keeping. Information they hoped would never be necessary to reveal, but which they prepared just in case this exact scenario unfolded." His words ignited a small flame of hope in the darkness that had enveloped me since the reading of the will. Perhaps my grandparents, wise and forward-thinking as always, had anticipated this battle and prepared accordingly. The courthouse loomed before me on the day of the hearing, its stone facade imposing and cold. Despite the warm morning, I felt chilled to the bone as I climbed the steps, Benjamin at my side. "Remember what we discussed," he said quietly as we approached the courtroom doors. "Let the evidence speak for itself. Try not to take their accusations personally, though I know that's asking a lot." Inside, my parents and Madison were already seated at the plaintiff's table with Peterson, whose sharp features and aggressive posture made him look like a predator sizing up his prey. Madison avoided my gaze entirely, studying her manicured nails with intense focus. My mother stared straight ahead, her posture rigid with righteous anger. Only my father glanced my way, his expression a mixture of determination and something that might have been regret. As Judge Andrea Coleman entered and the proceedings began, I tried to steady my breathing. The battle for my grandparents' legacy and the truth about our family was about to begin. The courtroom felt like a battlefield as Judge Coleman called the proceedings to order. Peterson opened with a devastating portrayal of me as a manipulative granddaughter who had systematically exploited elderly, vulnerable relatives for financial gain. "Your Honor," Peterson argued, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone defending the innocent, "the evidence will show that Abigail Blake took calculated advantage of Martha and Harold Blake's advanced age and isolation to secure an outrageously disproportionate inheritance. She visited them excessively, inserted herself into their financial affairs, and created deliberate friction between them and their loving family members." His words hung in the air like poison, each accusation designed to paint me as a predator who had stolen from my own family. I felt my hands trembling and forced myself to remain still, to trust in Benjamin's calm confidence. When it was Benjamin's turn to speak, his approach was markedly different, measured, methodical, and devastating in its quiet authority. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, I have documentation that Martha and Harold Blake anticipated this very situation and left specific instructions and evidence with me as their longtime attorney." He presented the first bombshell detailed financial records spanning 15 years, meticulously maintained by my grandfather in his characteristic, precise handwriting. "According to these records," Benjamin explained as Judge Coleman reviewed the thick folder, "Madison Blake received gifts totaling $1.8 million from her grandparents during their lifetime. This includes full payment of her college education, startup funding for 2 failed business ventures, coverage of significant personal debts on 7 separate occasions, and monthly allowances of $3,000 for the past 3 years." Peterson looked genuinely stunned, turning to confer hurriedly with my parents. My mother had gone visibly pale, her composed facade cracking. "Furthermore," Benjamin continued, The records show that Richard and Eleanor Blake borrowed $347,000 from Martha and Harold over the past 5 years, money that was never repaid, despite multiple requests and Richard Blake's successful law practice. This revelation hit like a physical blow. My father's face flushed red as he whispered urgently to Peterson, "These weren't gifts. These were loans my parents had simply chosen to ignore." But it was the third piece of evidence that truly shattered their case. Benjamin presented a small digital recorder to the court clerk. This audio recording was made by Martha and Harold Blake 4 months before their death, specifically addressing their estate decisions and their concerns about family dynamics. The courtroom fell silent as my grandparents' voices filled the space, strong and clear despite their age. "We are making this recording of our own free will and with full mental capacity," Grandpa Harold's familiar voice declared. "We want to address our decision regarding the distribution of our estate, particularly given the recent pressures we've faced from family members." Grandma Martha's voice followed, steady and determined. "We have made a deliberate choice to leave the majority of our estate to our granddaughter Abigail. This decision reflects not favoritism, but careful observation of character, responsibility, and genuine care demonstrated over many years." They proceeded to detail their reasoning with painful clarity. Madison's pattern of financial irresponsibility and expectation of bailouts, my parents' sense of entitlement to their money, and their inappropriate pressure to change the will. Most devastatingly, they described the Christmas confrontation my cousin had told me about. Richard actually suggested we were too old to manage our own affairs. Grandpa Harold's voice carried a note of deep sadness. "He threatened to have our mental capacity evaluated if we didn't comply with his demands for equal distribution. This from our own son." My mother covered her face with her hands. Beside her, my father stared at the table, his jaw clenched tight. "We love all our family," Grandma Martha concluded. "But we refuse to enable destructive patterns or reward a sense of entitlement. Abigail has shown the character and judgment we hope will preserve our legacy and values." As the recording ended, the courtroom remained in stunned silence. I wiped away tears, overwhelmed by hearing their voices again and by their posthumous protection of me. Judge Coleman's expression had shifted from neutral to deeply troubled. Peterson requested an immediate recess, but the damage was catastrophic. During the break, the truth came pouring out in ways no one had anticipated. Madison approached me in the courthouse hallway, her makeup completely destroyed by tears. "Abby, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom and Dad, they made me lie about the visits, about what you supposedly said to Grandma and Grandpa. None of it was true." Before I could respond, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and desperation. "They told me you were poisoning Grandma and Grandpa against me, that you were telling them I was irresponsible and selfish. They coached me on what to say to other family members, what to post on social media. They said if I didn't help them contest the will, I'd lose everything because you'd never share." The confession was devastating, but it wasn't over. "There's more," Madison sobbed. "Dad has gambling debts, bad ones. He owes money to people who... He's scared. Abby, they've been using Grandma and Grandpa's money for years to cover his losses. That's why they're so desperate without a bigger inheritance. He can't pay what he owes." This revelation explained so much: my father's increasing anxiety over the past year, my parents' unusual financial pressures despite his successful practice, their desperation to change the will. When we returned to court, Peterson made a brief statement that surprised everyone. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented and new information that has come to light, my clients wish to withdraw their petition contesting the will." But Judge Coleman wasn't finished. Her expression was grave as she addressed my parents directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Blake, Before I dismiss this case, I must note that the evidence presented today reveals deeply troubling patterns of financial manipulation and family exploitation. The court finds no evidence whatsoever of undue influence by the defendant. Rather, the evidence suggests the deceased were responding rationally to years of inappropriate financial pressure from the plaintiffs. She paused, letting her words sink in. Furthermore, the admission that false statements were made to family members and on social media platforms constitutes a serious abuse of the legal process. I am strongly considering sanctions, and I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential fraud charges related to the false claims made in this lawsuit. My father's face went white. Your Honor, I am not finished. Mr. Blake. Judge Coleman's voice cut through his attempt to speak. This court has rarely seen such a clear case of family members attempting to manipulate the legal system to override the legitimate wishes of the deceased. Your behavior has been reprehensible. As we filed out of the courtroom, the full magnitude of what had been revealed settled over us. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about a complete breakdown of family bonds, built on years of lies, manipulation, and financial exploitation. Madison grabbed my arm as we reached the courthouse steps. "Abby, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know everything good you remember about our grandparents was real. Everything they saw in you was real. I've been jealous of that my entire life. And instead of trying to earn it myself, I let Mom and Dad convince me to help them destroy it." Standing on those courthouse steps, looking at my broken family, I realized that my grandparents' greatest gift wasn't the money they'd left me. It was the truth that had finally been revealed. Painful as it was, they had known this day would come, and they had prepared me not just with financial security, but with the evidence needed to defend both their wishes and my own integrity. The inheritance had revealed who we all really were, and sometimes that revelation, however devastating, is the most valuable gift of all. The weeks following the trial were simultaneously liberating and devastating. I was finally free from the lawsuit's shadow, but I was also completely alone. My parents weren't speaking to me. Madison had disappeared from social media entirely. Even extended family members seemed afraid to take sides. It was during this period of isolation that Benjamin revealed my grandparents' final gift. 3 weeks after the trial, he called me to his office with news of a secondary trust I hadn't known existed. "Your grandparents established this account separately," he explained, showing me documents bearing my grandmother's familiar handwriting. $2 million, with a very simple stipulation: it's available to support family healing, should you choose to pursue that path. The conditions were straightforward. The money could be used to fund family therapy, with any remaining funds going to establish the scholarship foundation my grandparents had discussed with me years earlier. The choice of whether to even inform my family about this trust was entirely mine. I spent days wrestling with the decision. Part of me wanted to walk away completely, to build a new life without the people who had caused me so much pain. But Grandma Martha's voice echoed in my memory. Family is about character, about doing right by each other, especially when it's difficult. I decided to offer them a chance. The family meeting in Benjamin's office was awkward beyond description. My parents arrived looking subdued, the trial's revelations having shaken their usual confidence. Madison entered separately, giving me a hesitant nod. That was the first civil interaction we'd had in months. When Benjamin explained the secondary trust and its purpose, the room fell silent. My father was the first to speak. "So this is conditional on us admitting wrongdoing. It's conditional on genuine effort toward healing," I replied carefully. "The choice is yours." To my surprise, it was Madison who responded first. "I want to try," she said quietly. "Not because of the money, because I'm tired of being the person I became in this family." Dr. Hatte. Teresa Reynolds, specialized in family estrangement and reconciliation. Her office was warm but professional, designed to encourage honesty without feeling threatening. Our first session was stilted, everyone choosing their words carefully. Before we begin, Dr. Reynolds said after introductions, "I want to acknowledge the unusual circumstances that brought you here. Financial incentives for therapy aren't ideal, but they don't invalidate the work we might accomplish together if there's genuine desire for healing." Progress was slow and often painful. Some sessions ended with tears and slammed doors. Others brought small breakthroughs that felt miraculous after years of dysfunction. During our third month of therapy, my mother broke down while discussing a memory I'd shared a piano recital where she'd left early for Madison's dance class. "I don't even remember doing that," she sobbed, genuinely distressed. "There are so many moments you've mentioned that I just blocked out, but I can see how much they hurt you." "That's part of the problem," I replied gently. "These weren't memorable moments for you, but they were formative for me." Not everyone made equal progress. My father struggled with the loss of authority and the acknowledgement of his failures. There were setback sessions where old patterns resurged, where accusations flew, where someone stormed out. But there were also moments of genuine connection. Madison and I began meeting for coffee separately from family therapy, awkward conversations that gradually evolved into something resembling sisterhood. "I always envied you," she confessed during one such meeting. "You were so smart, so capable. Mom and Dad made everything so easy for me that I never developed confidence in my own abilities." "And I envied you," I admitted. "You had their love and attention without having to earn it." 2 years after my grandparents' passing, I stood in the garden of what had become truly my home, hosting the first annual scholarship reception for the Martha and Harold Blake Foundation. 20 students from challenging backgrounds had received full college funding, each one reminding me of myself at their age, hungry for opportunity and recognition. Madison was helping serve refreshments, her natural social skills making the teenagers feel welcomed and valued. Her own salon was thriving now, built on genuine effort rather than family bailouts. We still had difficult moments, but our relationship had found a new foundation in honesty. My parents had attended briefly, still uncomfortable in this setting, but making an effort that would have been unimaginable before. My mother had continued therapy even after the required period ended. Working through decades of patterns, she was finally ready to examine. My father remained more distant, but he occasionally surprised me with genuine interest in my work. As the reception wound down and guests departed, I found myself alone in Grandma Martha's rose garden, the scent of late summer blooms filling the evening air. I could almost feel their presence beside me, could almost hear Grandpa Harold's chuckle from the study window. "You were right," I whispered to their memory. "The most valuable inheritance isn't money, it's wisdom." The journey of healing hadn't been linear or complete. There were still days when old wounds ached, when I questioned whether forgiveness was the same as forgetting, when the progress felt fragile. My relationship with my parents would never be what I dreamed of as a child, desperate for their approval. But it had become something real, built on truth rather than pretense. I'd learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending the pain never existed. It means acknowledging the wounds, understanding their origins, and choosing a different path forward. It means accepting that some relationships will never be what we wished for while remaining open to what they might become with work and honesty. Most importantly, I had internalized what Grandpa Harold told me at my high school graduation. My worth existed independently of others' recognition. That knowledge, more than any financial inheritance, was the true gift my grandparents had left me. The foundation would continue their legacy, supporting students who understood what it meant to be overlooked, but not defeated. And I would carry forward their wisdom, proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't written in a will. It's written in the example of how to live with dignity, love without conditions, and see people for who they truly are. As I locked the house that evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. My grandparents had given me more than money. They had given me the strength to stand alone, the wisdom to forgive without forgetting, and the understanding that true family is built on character, not blood. The inheritance had divided us, but ultimately, it had also shown us who we really were. And sometimes, that truth, however painful, is the most valuable gift of all. Word count approximately 6,000 words.